Brilliant. So welcome and good morning, Harris. Hi, everyone. Delighted to have Harris with me today. Harris is a consultant clinical scientist at Guy's and St Thomas's and has had a really, really inspirational journey to where you are today. So Harris, tell us a little bit about your journey and what a fabulous title, consultant clinical scientist.
Yeah, thanks, Indra, for having me. It is a great title and a great responsibility. But there is quite a few of us in the NHS. My my journey to this point has been very weird and winding. Um, my academic background is in theoretical physics, and I thought I'd be working on fusion energy. Um, and then I realized I wanted to do something practical and something realistic.
Yeah,
So I tried AI in medicine.
really practical.
Really practical. Yeah, I know. So I graduated and then did the scientist training program, which is a postgrad program or graduate program for scientists working in the NHS in imaging as an MRI physicist, and then sort of slowly got more and more interested in digital health problems and the
Right.
problems that digital health could solve.
Yeah.
Um, got an expertise in medical software, medical devices, and started a PhD applying machine learning in brain tumor management. And that was a few years ago. And then that's where my experience and expertise with AI came to the fore. And so that's culminated in my current role.
Mhm.
Like you said, as a consultant clinical scientist, I'm head of clinical scientific computing, which is a new section at GSTT, where we're developing people, platforms, and policy for
Right.
digital health.
Brilliant. And if you had to give a nugget of advice or kind of guidance to those looking to embark on this journey, what would you say to them?
It's difficult, right?
Yeah.
Because it's easier having done it,
Mm.
and so it's not as easy to recommend it to others. I mean, the key ingredients I think that have allowed me to get to this stage
Yeah.
are one, being really fortunate in terms of who my supervisors and managers have been. I've been really fortunate that they've always been really accommodating and open to new ideas. Two, being able to do as much as you can by yourself,
Yeah.
um, especially in the early stages when you're trying to do something experimental or novel or something that people haven't seen before. It's really important that you can get to something demonstrable or demonstrably valuable with as fewer dependency as possible. So that means teaching yourself how to code, teaching yourself about patient pathways and health technology assessment, and that's the journey that I went through.
Yeah.
And depending on where you're from and where you're headed, it might look different. But that's another really important component. And then three is just making sure what you're doing is something that you're incredibly passionate about, because it's going to
Mm.
be difficult trying to carve out a new path. Yeah, but those three things.
Yeah. It is challenging, isn't it? Especially when it's not completely clear how to get to where you think you want to go and kind of navigating your way. Um, and talking about challenges and actually kind of navigating your way, we quite often talk about some of the challenges about implementing AI technologies into the health and social care sector. So just from your experience and some of the projects that you're working on, are there any, I mean, we do know what the challenges are, but from a kind of real practical and tangible aspect, is there anything you can share or tell us about how you've come across those and then overcome them if possible?
Yeah, so a lot of the work that we have done, say, in the past couple of years at Guidance at Thomas's, has been about how do we make ourselves an intelligent procurer of AI.
Mhm.
We felt, there's obviously a lot of ingredients and processes that go into getting artificial intelligence to sort of frontline care.
Yeah.
And, it starts from things like data curation and model development and everything else. And there's people working on all those components. And we felt as a hospital that we sort of needed to fix our territory, right? And
Mm.
if we are not effective at pulling technology in from the market and testing and deploying it, then we're not going to get better iterations in the future. So we developed a local framework that would allow us to very quickly and efficiently evaluate essentially a business case for an AI, and taking care of sort of the technical and clinical risks around it as well. And that process has been incredibly informative and productive. So to give you an example, we had an AI technology which we wanted to deploy to help with our out of hours reporting. So
Yeah.
overnight, support the radiology registrar to prioritize their workload. And we went through this internal process and identified what we think is the leading technology in the space, and found out through our sort of local technical validation that it actually performed quite poorly.
Okay.
And it threw up a few interesting issues. So one of the interesting issues was that it was rejecting a lot of our images, so it would refuse to analyze them.
Right.
And
Okay.
it seems like a very sort of basic sense check, but it's the kind of thing that gets sort of overlooked,
Mm.
particularly with sort of the enthusiasm that follows AI technology. Doing sort of your due diligence and your sort of proper evaluation of any sort of procurement is crucial. And then we've had other successful cases. So we've got pediatric bone aging rolled out, and we have for about 3 or 4 years now,
Yeah.
where we help pediatric radiologists calculate the developmental age of children through their hand X-rays. It's a task that's really amenable to AI,
Mm.
and that was a technology that passed the evaluation process, and we procured it, and we'd been using it. And in sort of the first 6 months, we had a couple of consultants start to complain that the technology was getting the answer wrong,
Right.
frankly. And so naturally, we investigated this, and so there's a nuance in bone age reporting, where if a child is below a certain age, you're not supposed to use the carpal bones essentially in your evaluation.
Mm.
And the AI was correctly ignoring these bones, and it was in fact some of our consultant colleagues who were incorrectly evaluating the bone age. And so that was a really interesting example of sort of machine human conflict, so to
Yeah.
speak. But it raised a really interesting question. Pediatric bone age is relatively low clinical risk
Yeah.
scenario. If there was a higher risk scenario, say a cancer MDT, clinical decision support system,
Mhm.
and there was a machine human conflict, we realized that we didn't have an established process of what you do in that situation. Uh, is it always whatever the consultant says goes? Obviously, in this scenario, that wouldn't have worked out. That would have been the incorrect decision. And the clinical decision resolution is one part of the issue. The other part of the issue is then how do you communicate this, or do you communicate this with the patient, with other staff?
Yeah.
And so we've had lots of those kinds of challenges and learnings, and it's been a fascinating journey so far. But I'm sure the more we delve into it, and especially in other medical specialties, for example, surgery and other places, there'll be even more of these knotty issues that we'll have to work through.
Yeah. Knotty problems. We do like coming across those, don't we? I just wanted to pick up on one thing that you said, because some of our listeners might not be so familiar with procurement, the beautiful word that we have in the NHS. And you mentioned, how to become a bit more of an intelligent procurer, which I think is a fantastic way to go about it. So if you had to share or kind of expand a bit more on what is it that makes someone an intelligent procurer, or how do you really, if you're on the other side, get into that system?
So, I mean, from my perspective, to be an intelligent procurer, especially when it comes to AI, is to essentially simplify your problem.
Yeah.
And what I mean to say is that AI offers, even very narrow AI technologies offer several benefits, often in a single patient pathway or operational workflow. And trying to understand or capture all of them is an unnecessary and sometimes insurmountable task. What you really want to focus on is what is the key sort of KPI that would allow me to justify deploying purchasing and deploying this software. And so that's what we start with. We start with what is the sort of the acute problem. So with the overnight reporting, it was missed or delayed intracranial hemorrhages.
Right.
So that was the only thing we cared about. Of course, there's other benefits, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's benefits in turnaround time, in emergency discharge, and all the other things. But if we tried to make that whole business case, it would have been impossible. And so what we did was, if we solved this problem, would that be a big enough problem to have solved to justify the procurement? And the answer is yes. And then based on that, we sort of build out the sort of requirements for the procurement. So what our standards are on sort of false positives and the sensitivity of the algorithm to intracranial hemorrhages and things like that. So you sort of work backwards. So that's what's most important, is to find what your key KPI is.
Yeah. And I think that's a really important piece of advice to share, because quite often people think, oh, you know, AI and algorithms and models, they can solve this huge chunk of the care pathway, but actually really narrowing it down to something quite specific, and then kind of saying, well, is this going to change our outcomes? It is a great piece of advice.
We also, just to add, Indra, sorry, the other thing that we've, so obviously a lot of large teaching hospitals like ourselves and other hospitals and DGHs get involved in AI, and what you often see is a scenario that looks more like code development, right? So you'll have a technology company who will lend or license their technology to the hospital for free or at very minimal cost, and in return there'll be, you know, feedback data or something else of value going back to the technology company. The issues with those scenarios is that you don't get a sort of a true and independent evaluation of the value of this technology, right? Because you've suddenly become a vested partner in the technology, whereas as a sort of agnostic buyer, you're simply sort of taking the technology as a black box, basically. And like I said before, there's lots of investment already in developing AI technologies, right? And the AI lab has obviously invested a lot in promoting the pipeline of delivering technologies to the market. And there's already hundreds of market approved technologies on the market. And so what we really need hospitals to be trying to do is becoming those efficient buyers. And it's really important very early on, when you're trying to tackle a clinical problem, is which of these two things do we want to be? And not to blur the two. Because sometimes they think that they're buying an AI technology and they end up falling into the former kind of relationship. And then it becomes very difficult when it comes to asking the board to fund it long term, because you haven't set out sort of an objective evaluation which you could document in a business case. So that's the other sort of tidbit.
Yeah, no, really, really important. And we see so often that people, it's always an exciting thing, isn't it, to develop something and really kind of figure out what is the thing that you want to develop, but actually deploying it and then understanding whether it's going to work or not is always the far trickier aspect. So just moving on a little bit to the future, you've given some really good case examples, and also where you've had, you know, good success stories, but sometimes come across a problem and try to overcome that. And so people always ask me this question. I find it incredibly difficult. You know, what do you think the next 5 or 10 years holds? So I'm not going to ask you that. I'm just going to say, over the next year or two, what do you think you'd really like to see in this space, and maybe even at Guy's and St Thomas's?
Can I answer both questions?
Go for it. Go for your life.
Yeah, awesome. So, so in the next year or two, what we are doing locally, but in partnership with a lot of national and international efforts, is very much focused at the hospital end, obviously, and it's around two things primarily. So one is around platforms. So as Guy's Thomas is a member of the London AI Centre consortium, which is funded by Innovate UK and the Office of Life Sciences, where we're developing some core enabling technologies for the NHS to allow us to more easily do the deployment phase. What's difficult these days when you're trying to evaluate locally and deploy locally is that, you know, every AI application or vendor usually wants their own sort of hardware in the hospital, wants their own sort of plumbing to your PAC systems and to your EPR. And if you're doing all of that legwork just for a trial, having to unplug it becomes a bit of a pain. So it slows down that sort of iterative cycle. So what I would be keen to see in the next year or two is the standardization of a sort of a PACS for AI, essentially. So what PACS has done for imaging modalities, something like that for AI. And then the other aspect is around training and education. So we've invested quite a lot locally around sort of how do we embed data science and AI training into routine clinical training. So obviously there's lots of efforts and initiatives around digital health fellowships and the digital academy and things like that. And they work effectively, but there is still a significant demand of how do you scale, at the very least, sort of literacy in AI and digital health across a broader population in the NHS workforce as possible. So that medical trainees, for example, don't have to go out of program or part-time and things like that. So those two things are sort of my near-term sort of hopes and goals. Long-term, I think that the AI marketplace is going to look radically different. At the moment, we deal with, as a hospital and as the AI Centre Consortium, sort of 90% SME startup type companies, often less than 10, 15 people, very often 2, 3 people. And it's very difficult to see how that is a sustainable model economically for those individual companies. And what we'll see is a trend that can go two ways, or maybe it will go both ways. One is that things will sort of coalesce back to the traditional large vendors that already have, for example, sales channels and estate within hospitals. And then the other end looks something very different. So I always talk about that there's 3 core ingredients to AI products. So data, clinical insight, and the algorithm. And AI is a unique community in that it commoditizes itself, right? So you can get algorithms off of GitHub for free, essentially, and they'll be cutting edge. And then data and clinical insight exists inside the hospital. And I always say that this is a bit like having all the ingredients for a meal in your kitchen and then carrying them to a restaurant and paying a chef to cook them for you, where we take all of the value in the hospital and we take it outside and then pay for the meal back, when really we should be learning how to cook. And maybe the future of medical AI will look a bit more like what clinical analytics and financial reporting looks like in the NHS, where what you do is you use generic tools in financial reporting, clinical analytics, is things like Power BI, Excel, and you hire analysts and they do bespoke reports and analysis for your local problems. And maybe in 5 to 10 years, what medical AI will actually look like is we'll have a bunch of generic tools, object detectors, classifiers, predictors, and we'll employ clinical data scientists to solve local problems for each institution.
Great. Love it. Totally supportive of that. And I like the fact that we shouldn't be taking our ingredients to the restaurant. We should be learning to cook ourselves. It's quite tricky to cook sometimes, isn't it?
It
for those
is,
of us who've been, making bread over the lockdown period. I, for one, haven't tried. That's great. I really love that analogy. And so just to close then, Harris, if you had to give any nuggets, any hopes, dreams, how have you, got to where you are in a nutshell of information or sharing, whatever you fancy saying, I'll leave it to you.
That's a toughie. I mean, always know why you're doing something. And the very first question you asked about, or the second question about what advice you'd give to people, and people often confuse the purpose with the activity. They say, "Oh, I want to do AI," and they never ask why, right? and I've always been incredibly passionate about solving problems and helping people. And so every day I come to work, and for me, it's like solving a Rubik's Cube, but it potentially helps someone's life. And I think the best advice I'd give to anyone else is to find your Rubik's Cube and maybe help someone at the same time.
Brilliant. I love that. The Rubik's Cube and the key to life. Awesome. Well, Harris, thank you so much. It's been really good. And hopefully all of our listeners have enjoyed it too. Have a great day and hopefully see you soon. Take care.
Thank you, Indra.